Do I deserve a second chance? I mean, I did it with my own son. Yes, my son. A child I once carried at my bosom. Well, there are moments in life you can't undo, choices so heavy, so irreversible, that they haunt you every waking second. The kind of moments that rewrite the story of who you thought you were, leaving you with a version of yourself you can barely recognize. I never thought I'd find myself here, telling this story. Not to justify it. Not to make sense of it. But because the truth refuses to stay buried, no matter how deeply you try to hide it. It began with something so small, so innocent, I didn't even notice the shift at first. A glance that lingered too long. A conversation that strayed into territory it shouldn't have. And then there was the night, that night, when everything changed, and the lines I thought would never blur vanished completely. He came into my bedroom late. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak of the floor, every whisper of the air. I thought he needed something, a simple question, maybe, or just the comfort of being near me. But when he sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of his presence felt different. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine in a way that made my heart race, not with fear, but with something I couldn't name. Something I didn't want to name. Are you okay? I asked, my voice soft, unsure of what to make of the moment. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it carried a weight I didn't know how to bear. You've been so distant, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I miss how close we used to be. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, as if they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. I should have stopped him then, should have told him to leave, to go back to his room. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent. And in that silence, everything began to unravel. He leaned closer, and I didn't pull away. His hand moved to my shoulder, his touch hesitant but insistent, as if he was waiting for me to stop him. I should have. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop this, to put an end to something that could never be undone. But I didn't. The air in the room felt suffocating, charged with an energy that I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. When he kissed me, it wasn't forceful or aggressive. It was soft, almost questioning, like he was seeking permission for something he knew he shouldn't want. And I let it happen. I let it happen because, in that moment, I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I wasn't thinking about what this meant, about the lines we were crossing. I was thinking about the connection I'd felt slipping away for so long, about the void I didn't even know I was trying to fill. What followed was a blur of emotions, guilt, confusion, longing, shame. Each touch, each movement, felt both wrong and inevitable, like we were caught in a storm we couldn't escape. When it was over, we lay there in silence, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on both of us. I turned away, unable to meet his gaze, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. This can't happen again, I said finally, my voice shaking. I know, he replied, but there was something in his tone, something I didn't want to acknowledge. And yet, it did happen again. And again. Each time, the guilt grew heavier, the shame more suffocating. But so did the pull, the connection that neither of us could seem to break. This isn't just a story about regret. It's about the darkness that can exist within us, the choices we make in moments of weakness, and the pain of living with what we've done. He was my son, my child, someone I had raised, cared for, and loved in ways only a parent can. Our bond had always been close, built on years of trust and understanding. But somewhere along the way, that closeness began to shift in ways I didn't fully understand. Looking back now, I wonder if I ignored the signs because I didn't want to see them, or because I didn't know how to. It started so simply, so innocently. He would come to me in moments of doubt, seeking comfort, seeking guidance. And as his mother, I gave it without hesitation, believing I was helping him navigate the struggles of growing up. But over time, our conversations grew deeper, more personal, as if we were confiding in each other as equals rather than as parent and child. There was one evening I remember clearly. It was late, the house was quiet, and I was sitting in my room, lost in thought. He knocked softly, then stepped inside before I could respond. Can we talk? He asked, his voice hesitant but familiar. I smiled, gesturing for him to sit beside me. Of course, I said, thinking nothing of it. After all, he had always turned to me when he needed someone to listen. At first, it was like any other conversation. He spoke about school, his frustrations, his fears of not measuring up. I listened, offering words of encouragement, reassuring him that he was capable, that he was enough. But as the night wore on, the tone of our conversation began to shift. He started asking questions, not about life or his future, but about me. Do you ever feel lonely? He asked, his gaze steady, his expression serious. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated before answering, unsure of how honest I should be. Sometimes, I admitted. But that's normal, isn't it? He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave mine. You don't have to be, he said softly. There was something in his voice, in the way he spoke, that made me feel uneasy. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the vulnerability of the moment, the closeness we'd always shared. As the conversation continued, I noticed the way he looked at me, different, searching, as if he was seeing me in a way he hadn't before. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt myself drawn into that gaze, unable to look away. You've always been there for me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I'd do without you. His words should have warmed my heart. Instead, they sent a chill down my spine. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. It was such a small gesture, so familiar, yet in that moment, it felt different. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining the tension in the air. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Looking back now, I wonder why I didn't stop him that night, why I didn't put an end to whatever was beginning to form between us. Maybe I didn't want to see it for what it truly was. Maybe I didn't know how to. But in that moment, sitting there in the quiet of my room, the lines that had always defined our relationship began to blur. And from that night on, nothing was ever the same. We were both searching for something, though at the time, I didn't understand what it was. Connection. Comfort. An escape from the pain we couldn't name. Loneliness had settled into both our lives in different ways, creating a void we didn't know how to fill. For him, it was the need for closeness, for a presence that grounded him during moments of uncertainty. For me, it was the longing for validation, for a reminder that I was still important, still needed. But those needs collided in ways I never expected, leading us down a path I'll regret for the rest of my life. It happened late one night, just like before. He came into my room, his face a mix of vulnerability and something else I couldn't quite place. I should have sent him back, told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I let him stay, convincing myself that he just needed someone to talk to. We sat there in silence for a while, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Then, he reached for me, not in the way a son reaches for his mother, but in a way that felt wrong, that made my heart race for all the wrong reasons. I froze. Everything in me screamed to stop him, to pull away, to end whatever was happening before it could begin. But I didn't. I sat there, paralyzed by confusion and fear, unable to make the choice I knew I should. And in not stopping him, I made the worst decision of my life. His hand lingered on mine, his touch hesitant but insistent. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the question he wasn't asking but that hung in the air between us. When he leaned in, I didn't move. I didn't pull away. And in that moment, the boundary that should have never been crossed shattered completely. The aftermath was immediate and crushing. As he left the room that night, the weight of what had just happened hit me like a tidal wave. I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How did it come to this? How had I let it happen? Each time it happened after that, I told myself it would be the last. I promised myself I would stop, that I would set things right. But the pull between us only grew stronger, the connection we shared tightening like a rope around my neck. The guilt was suffocating. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back at me, a person I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't forgive. The secrecy became unbearable. Each glance, each whispered word, felt like a betrayal of everything I believed I stood for. But no matter how much I wanted to stop, I didn't know how. We lived in the shadows of what we'd done, carrying the weight of our actions in silence. And with each passing day, the tension between us became harder to ignore, the guilt more impossible to bear. I told myself I was doing it for him, for his sake, for the comfort he needed. But the truth was, I was as lost as he was, trapped in a cycle I couldn't break. One night, the weight of it all became unbearable. The guilt, the shame, the endless cycle of secrecy, it was too much to carry any longer. I sat alone in my room, the quiet of the house amplifying every thought racing through my mind. I couldn't keep pretending. Not to him, not to myself. When he came in that night, like he had so many times before, I didn't greet him. I didn't look at him. My hands trembled as I tried to find the words to say what had been building inside me for so long. I can't do this anymore, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He froze, standing just inside the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and fear. What do you mean? He asked, his tone cautious, as if he already knew but didn't want to hear it. I mean this, I said, my voice breaking. Everything we've been doing, it's wrong. It's not what we're supposed to be. He stepped closer, his expression shifting from confusion to something more vulnerable, more broken. But I thought we were okay, he said, his voice trembling. I thought you understood me. His words cut through me like a blade. I could see the pain in his eyes, the way he struggled to make sense of what I was saying. And in that moment, I realized just how deeply I had failed him, not as a partner, but as a parent. I broke down then, tears streaming down my face as I confessed everything, not just to him, but to myself. I told him how ashamed I was, how lost I'd felt, how I had let my own weaknesses cloud my judgment. I should have protected you, I said through sobs. I should have been stronger, better. But I wasn't. And now I don't know how to fix this. He sat down beside me, his own tears falling silently. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know what else to do. Hearing his words only deepened the ache in my chest. I realized then that this wasn't just my failure, it was ours. We had both been searching for something, but in finding each other, we had destroyed the very foundation of trust and love we were meant to share. After that night, everything changed. The bond we had shared, the closeness that had once felt so comforting, was gone. Replaced by silence. We avoided each other as much as we could, the weight of what had happened hanging in the air between us like a storm cloud. Each glance, each word, was laced with unspoken guilt and pain. I withdrew into myself, consumed by self-loathing and regret. I couldn't look at him without seeing the ways I had failed, the ways I had let us both down. And I knew he felt the same. The house, once filled with warmth and connection, became a place of isolation. The trust we had relied on was shattered, and neither of us knew how to begin picking up the pieces. The bond we'd shared was gone, replaced by a silence that neither of us could break. And in that silence, I was left to confront the full weight of what I had done, and the darkness it had left behind. After that night, I knew there was no going back. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, suffocating, relentless. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every quiet moment was filled with the echoes of my choices, the guilt gnawing at me from the inside. I knew I couldn't undo what I had done. The damage was there, etched into both of us in ways that could never be erased. But I also knew that if I didn't confront it, if I didn't try to understand why and how I had let this happen, I would never be able to move forward. The first step was admitting that I needed help. It wasn't easy. I felt ashamed, terrified of what people would think, of what it would mean to say those words out loud. But I couldn't carry the burden alone any longer. I reached out to a therapist, someone I hoped could help me untangle the mess I had made. Walking into that room for the first time felt like stepping into a spotlight, every flaw, every failure exposed. But as I began to speak, to lay bare the truth of what had happened, I realized that the act of saying it out loud was the first step toward understanding it. In therapy, I began to confront the pain I had caused, not just to him, but to myself. I started to see the cracks in my own foundation, the ways I had ignored my own struggles and allowed them to fester. I had to face the darkness within me, the parts of myself I had been too afraid to acknowledge. Every day is a battle. A battle to forgive myself, to accept that I made a mistake that can never be undone. There are moments when the guilt feels insurmountable, when I wonder if I will ever be able to move past the person I was in those moments. Do you think I deserve a second chance?